There are silences that mean nothing, the pause between radio checks, the quiet after a door closes, the stillness before a briefing begins, and then there are silences that mean everything, the kind that arrive without warning, that settle into a frequency like sediment, and refuse, regardless of what you do, regardless of how many times you key the transmitter and say a call sign into static, to lift. NATO's Northern Listening Network in 1952 was not a glamorous posting. It was a collection of hardened concrete structures, antenna arrays, and frozen men doing frozen work at the edge of a continent that had barely finished bleeding. The Soviet threat was not theoretical. It moved. It breathed. It tested boundaries with the patience of something that understood that time in the long run belonged to whoever was willing to wait. Station Eidfjord, call sign Lighthouse, sat approximately 340 meters above sea level on a coastal ridge in Hardanger, western Norway. 3 men, 1 ANGRC-26 radio transceiver, a diesel generator, 6 weeks of rations, a rotation schedule that assumed the world outside would remain broadly cooperative. The 3-man crew assigned to Lighthouse in November 1952 were not extraordinary men. That is important. They were not selected for psychological resilience or unusual capability. They were signals operators, competent, vetted, unremarkable in the way that essential people often are. Warrant Officer 2nd Class Einar Holt, Norwegian Army Signals Corps, 31 years old, 3 prior winter rotations, known in his unit for his habit of annotating technical manuals in the margins, small, precise notes in pencil that no one else could read without a magnifying lens. Corporal Dag Svensson, attached from Swedish Liaison, 24, fluent in 3 languages, including Russian, which was the entire reason he was there. Private First Class Thomas Briggs, U.S. Army, temporarily seconded to the NATO Observer Program, 22 years old, from Duluth, Minnesota, the only one of the 3 who had never seen a winter like the one waiting for him on that ridge. They arrived at Lighthouse on November 3, 1952, at approximately 1400 hours local time. The previous rotation had departed without incident. The handover log was clean, equipment functional, generator stable, antenna array intact. The outgoing crew left 4 days of fresh bread, 2 cans of coffee, and a note in Norwegian that Briggs later said Svensson translated as simply, "Keep the heat on, the ridge doesn't forgive." For 9 days, Lighthouse performed exactly as designed, routine transmissions, atmospheric readings logged every 6 hours, Soviet naval traffic monitored, transcribed, forwarded through the chain, nothing unusual, nothing worth marking. Then, on November 12 at 0347 hours, Lighthouse transmitted its last scheduled check-in. The duty operator at the relay station in Bergen logged the signal as clear, 5x5, standard close. At 0600 the next scheduled transmission did not arrive. At 0900 it did not arrive. By 1200, the relay station had attempted contact on 4 separate frequencies, primary, secondary, emergency, and 1 frequency that officially did not appear in any documentation filed after the event. Nothing came back, not static, not interference, not the partial carrier wave you get when a transmitter is damaged but still powered. Nothing. There is a difference between a radio that is broken and a radio that has been silenced. A broken transmitter leaves evidence, carrier bleed, harmonic drift, the electromagnetic equivalent of a body still warm. When equipment fails in the cold, it fails loudly. Capacitors crack, solder joints fracture, power draws spike before they collapse. The Bergen relay operators knew this. They had heard broken radios before. What they were hearing from Lighthouse was not a broken radio. It was absence, pure and deliberate, as if the station had not malfunctioned but had simply decided at 0347 on a November morning to stop existing. The decision to send a relief team was not made immediately. That is worth noting. In the official NATO incident summary, a document that took 11 years to be partially declassified and another 20 to be located by a researcher in Oslo, there is a gap of nearly 19 hours between the first missed transmission and the authorization of a response patrol. 19 hours during which 3 men on a ridge in Hardanger were, as far as anyone in the chain of command was willing to commit to paper, simply unaccounted for. The relief team dispatched on the morning of November 13th consisted of 4 men. Lieutenant Knut Andreasen, Norwegian Army, patrol-led. 2 enlisted signals technicians whose names appear in the summary only as initials, and a Norwegian civilian contractor identified in the document as a communications recovery specialist, a designation that, in 1952 NATO parlance, typically meant someone cleared for things that didn't appear in standard personnel files. They left the Bergen staging area at 0520. The ridge approach in November required a 4-hour climb under full kit. Temperature at departure, -11°C. Wind from the northwest at approximately 30 kilometers per hour. Visibility intermittent due to low cloud moving in off the fjord. Andreasen logged the weather condition in his personal notes as workable, barely. They reached the Lighthouse approach trail at 0940. What Andreasen recorded next, and this is drawn from his personal journal, not the official summary, a journal that his daughter donated to a private military archive in 1987, was not the station itself, it was the quiet. He had been to Lighthouse before, 2 years prior on a routine inspection. He remembered the sound of the ridge in winter, wind against antenna wire, the low mechanical hum of the generator audible from 80 meters out, the occasional creak of the prefabricated structure settling against the freeze. None of that was present. At approximately 0947, at a distance of roughly 100 meters from the station perimeter, Andreasen raised his fist and the patrol stopped. "Stilly," he wrote. For Stilly, too quiet. The generator was not running. That was the first confirmation of something wrong. The ANGRC-26 required continuous power. Without the generator, the radio was dead regardless of operator intent. But a generator failure explained a missed transmission. It did not explain why no one had come outside to investigate, to signal manually, to do any of the dozen things a trained signals crew would do the moment their primary power source failed in hostile weather. The patrol advanced in a staggered file, weapons unshouldered, not because there was a threat they could name, because Andreasen had been in the war and his body remembered, independent of his reasoning, that silence like this deserved a ready weapon. The outer door of the station was closed but unlocked. The inner door was open. Inside, all 3 bunks were occupied, blankets pulled, personal effects in order. Einar Holt's annotated manual open on the small table beside his bunk, pencil resting in the spine as if he had set it down to sleep and intended to return to it. All 3 men were present. All 3 were alive. None of them would speak, not to Andreasen, not to the technicians, not to the civilian contractor who, according to the journal, spent 40 minutes attempting conversation in Norwegian, English, and what Andreasen described as something else, something that made the youngest technician leave the room. Holt, Svensson, and Briggs sat where they were placed. They tracked movement with their eyes. They responded to physical contact, a hand on the shoulder, a cup of water pressed into the hand, with the mechanical compliance of men operating at some level below conscious decision. They ate when food was put in front of them. They moved when directed to move, but they did not speak, not one word, not one sound. For 11 days after their extraction, this remained true. The medical personnel who examined them at the Bergen facility found no injury, no frostbite, no signs of gas exposure or carbon monoxide poisoning, which had been the first working theory given the generator failure. Blood work unremarkable, neurological response within normal parameters, hearts beating, lungs breathing, eyes tracking. 3 men in perfect physiological condition who had, by every behavioral measure, returned from Lighthouse as something fundamentally less than who they had been when they arrived. On the 12th day, Briggs spoke. He asked what day it was. When told, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice the attending nurse described in her log as completely flat, like a man reading coordinates, "We were not alone up there." He did not elaborate. He could not be made to elaborate. The question of what exactly had shared that ridge with 3 NATO signals operators for 11 days in November 1952 was one that the subsequent investigation, conducted by personnel whose identities were redacted in full, declined officially to answer. What the investigation did produce was a single line of conclusion, typed at the bottom of the final summary page in a font slightly smaller than the rest of the document, as if whoever wrote it had hoped it might go unread. Environmental factors consistent with prolonged sensory anomaly. Further inquiry not recommended, not recommended, not concluded, not resolved, not closed, not recommended. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment. Further inquiry not recommended, not because it tells you anything, but because of what it refuses to tell you. In 30 years of reading declassified military documentation, incident summaries, field reports, after-action reviews, I have learned that the most dangerous information a government document can contain is not what it says. It is the shape of what it avoids, the outline of the thing left unnamed, the negative space where an explanation should be and isn't. Not recommended is not a conclusion. It is a decision. A deliberate choice made by someone with sufficient authority to end an inquiry, to look at whatever had been recovered from that ridge and determine that the cost of knowing exceeded the cost of not knowing. That decision was made in 1952. It has not, to my knowledge, been revisited. What we have instead are fragments. Andreassen's journal. 3 pages of the Bergen medical log that survived a 1971 filing purge because they had been misfiled under a Danish naval exercise. The single photograph, provenance uncertain, showing the interior of Lighthouse station, taken based on the equipment visible, sometime between 1950 and 1954. In the photograph, the ANGRC-26 sits on its bench, handset resting in its cradle. The logbook is open, and on the wall above the radio, scratched into the painted concrete with what appears to be a stylus or the point of a compass, is a series of marks. Not letters, not numbers, not any notation system used in NATO signals protocol. Repeating marks, identical, arranged in rows of 11. The photograph has been examined by 2 analysts I contacted independently. Neither could identify the notation system. One suggested it might be a tally, the instinctive marks a confined person makes to count days. The other said that interpretation didn't hold because the marks were too regular, too controlled, to be the product of someone counting under duress. They looked, she said, like someone had been transcribing something, receiving something, and recording it the only way available to them after, and this is speculation, her speculation, not mine, after whatever they were receiving had rendered the radio itself unnecessary. I don't know what to do with that. I have sat with it for a long time, and I still don't know what to do with it. What I know is this. Einar Holt was discharged from the Norwegian Army in March 1953 on medical grounds. The discharge paperwork cited nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis broad enough in that era to cover almost anything that command didn't want on the record in specific terms. He returned to his family home outside Voss. His daughter, the same woman who later donated his journal to the archive, told the researcher who contacted her in 1989 that her father never discussed his military service after his discharge. Not once. Not to her. Not to her mother. Not to anyone. Except once. In the winter of 1971, during a particularly heavy snowfall that kept the family indoors for 3 days, Holt sat at the kitchen table and watched the snow against the window for a long time. His daughter was 19. She remembered it precisely because of what he said, and because of the way he said it. Not as a confession, not as a story, but as a statement of fact delivered to no one in particular. The way a man states something he has long since made peace with not being believed. He said, "Det var ika vire. Det var noe som sa pa oss genom vire." It was not the weather. It was something watching us through the weather. Then he went to bed. His daughter said she never asked him what he meant. She said she understood, even at 19, that the question would cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. Dag Svensson's file presents a different kind of silence. He returned to Sweden following his medical discharge and, according to Swedish civil records, lived a broadly ordinary life. Married, 2 children, worked as a civilian radio technician for a broadcasting company in Gothenburg until his retirement in 1981. The researcher who tracked him down in 1986, 6 months before Svensson's death from a cardiac event, described the meeting as brief and one-sided. Svensson had agreed to speak. He sat across a table in his kitchen, hands flat on the surface, and looked at the researcher for a long time before he said anything. What he said was not about Lighthouse. It was not about the 11 days. It was not about what the 3 of them had or hadn't seen on that ridge. He said, "Jag hord det fortfarande ibland, på frekvenser som inte borde finnas." I still hear it sometimes, on frequencies that shouldn't exist. The researcher asked what it was. Svensson looked at his hands. "En signal," he said. "Men inte från någon station." A signal, but not from any station. He did not speak again during the visit. He walked the researcher to the door, shook hands with the precise formality of a man who had spent a career in technical work, and closed the door quietly behind him. Thomas Briggs is the only one of the 3 whose post-service life I have been unable to trace with any confidence. U.S. Army discharge records from that period are inconsistently archived. A Thomas R. Briggs from Duluth appears in a 1960 Minnesota census. Occupation listed as electrical technician, no further detail. Whether this is the same man, I cannot confirm. What I can confirm is that in 1987, a letter arrived at the private military archive in Oslo that had received Holt's journal. The letter was unsigned. The postmark was smudged beyond identification. Inside was a single index card. On it, in handwriting that the archivist described as extremely precise, small, controlled, the handwriting of someone trained to work in confined spaces with limited light, were 11 words. It was still transmitting when we left. We did not turn it off. The ANGRC-26 recovered from Lighthouse Station during the November 13th extraction had been examined by the signals technicians on Andreassen's team. Their assessment, recorded in the Bergen facility log, was unambiguous. The radio had been non-functional for the entire duration of the 11-day silence. The generator had failed. The battery backup had discharged. By every technical measure available, Lighthouse had been completely without power from sometime in the early hours of November 12th, until the patrol's arrival on the 13th. There was no power source that could have sustained a transmission. There was nothing in that station that should have been able to send or receive anything. And yet, I have spent considerable time deciding how to end this account, not because the facts are unclear. The facts, such as they are, have been laid out with as much precision as fragmentary evidence allows. 3 men, 11 days, a silence that preceded them and in certain respects never fully lifted. What resists conclusion is not the evidence but the implication. The thing the evidence points toward when you arrange it carefully and step back and allow yourself to see its shape. So let me be direct about what that shape is. At 0347 hours on November 12, 1952, Lighthouse Station transmitted its final scheduled check-in. The Bergen relay operator confirmed receipt. Signal clear. 5x5, standard close. At some point in the hours that followed, the exact time cannot be established, the generator failed. Power to the ANGRC-26 was lost. The station went dark in every technical sense of that word, and yet the 3 men inside did not leave, did not signal manually, did not activate the emergency protocols that every NATO signals operator was trained to execute within the first 30 minutes of a primary communications failure. They remained in their bunks or near them through 11 days of a Norwegian coastal winter in a structure without heat. The generator also powered the heating elements at temperatures that the Bergen meteorological record shows dropped as low as -19 Celsius during that period. They should not have survived that. The medical examination found no evidence of hypothermia, no tissue damage consistent with prolonged cold exposure, nothing in the physiological record that indicated their bodies had experienced 11 days in a structure without heat in the Norwegian winter of 1952. The investigation's conclusion, environmental factors consistent with prolonged sensory anomaly, does not account for this. It cannot account for this. It is not designed to account for this. It is designed to close a door. I am not going to tell you what was on that ridge. I am not going to construct a theory and present it to you as though I have access to information that resolves what 3 governments and a NATO inquiry declined to resolve. That would be dishonest, and dishonesty, in a story like this, is a particular kind of violence against the men who lived it. What I will tell you is what the evidence suggests, without embellishment and without conclusion. Something was present at Lighthouse Station during those 11 days that the official record has chosen not to name. It communicated, if that word applies, through or within a frequency that should not have been accessible without power. It left 3 trained signals operators physiologically intact but behaviorally altered in ways that partial recovery could not fully reverse. It marked the interior of the station in a notation system that 2 independent analysts, examining the photographic evidence decades later, could not identify or explain. And according to the unsigned index card that arrived in Oslo in 1987, from a sender whose identity remains unknown but whose handwriting bore the precision of a man trained to work with radio equipment in confined spaces, it was still transmitting when they left. They did not turn it off. You cannot turn off something you did not turn on. Holt died in 1979. His daughter has not spoken publicly about the kitchen table conversation since the 1989 interview. She declined all subsequent contact from researchers. Svensson died in 1986, 6 months after his interview, of a cardiac event that his physician noted was unusual given his prior health record. The researcher who visited him filed the interview transcript with the Oslo archive and, according to archive correspondence, never submitted another inquiry related to Lighthouse or any associated incident. The photograph of the station interior, the one showing the scratched marks above the radio, was donated to the archive in 1991 by an anonymous source. The accompanying note said only that it had been found among the personal effects of a retired NATO communications officer whose name the donor declined to provide. The marks in the photograph number 247. 11 rows. The last row incomplete. I have counted them multiple times. The result is always the same. 247 marks. 11 days, 22 hours and 36 minutes, if you assume each mark represents 1 hour from the moment the generator failed to the moment Andreassen's patrol opened the outer door. That calculation puts the beginning of whatever happened at Lighthouse at 0611 hours on November 12, 1952, approximately 2 hours and 24 minutes after the final transmission, approximately the time it would take in November darkness for whatever had been waiting on that ridge to determine that the station's outward connection to the world below had been severed and would not be quickly restored. I do not know what patience like that implies about the nature of the thing that exercised it. I do not know what kind of intelligence waits 2 hours and 24 minutes before moving. I do not know what it wanted from 3 men in a concrete structure on a Norwegian ridge, or what it gave them in exchange for 11 days of their silence. What I know is that Dag Svensson, in the last recorded conversation of his life, said he still heard it, on frequencies that shouldn't exist, after 34 years, after a career spent among radio equipment, among the static and signal of a world that communicates constantly, noisily, across every available band. He still heard it. That is not a metaphor. Svensson was a technical man. He did not speak in metaphors. He meant it in the precise, literal way that a man who understands frequencies uses the word frequency. Something was still transmitting, from somewhere he could not locate on any dial, in a signal he could not decode but could not stop receiving. If you work in signals, if you spend time in remote postings, if you have ever sat alone in a cold structure with a radio and heard something in the static that made you reconsider the nature of what static actually is, check your logs, not for what you reported, for what you didn't. The ridge at Hardanger still stands. Lighthouse Station was formally decommissioned in 1961. The structure, according to the Norwegian Defense Estates Agency, was demolished in 1963 to prevent unauthorized access. The antenna foundations, according to satellite imagery available through public geographic databases, are still visible. 11 concrete footings, arranged in a pattern that does not match any standard NATO antenna array configuration documented in the public record. 11, always 11, static, silence, signal.